Welcome, everyone. We are more or less at our start time. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. My name's Andrew Gage. My pronouns are he, him. I'm a staff lawyer with West Coast Environmental Law, and I am joining you from the territory of the Lekwungen-speaking people on the south end of what's now known as Vancouver Island. Um, and I would like to acknowledge that people are joining from all around the province, all across the country, and indeed, in a few cases, from beyond Canada's borders. So I would invite you to take a moment to reflect on the Indigenous nations who have stewarded the lands you live and to join us on this webinar from time immemorial. And uh, Perhaps we can all aspire to deepen our relationship with both those peoples and also the lands where we're residing. I am going to invite you, and some people have already started doing this, to introduce yourself in the chat, indicate where you're joining from, and the nations of the people there, if you are affiliated with an organization or are looking to get something out of our session this evening, please feel free to indicate that in the chat. I am joined by Ben Dodd, who is also from West Coast Environmental Law. He's going to be helping with the logistics, hopefully drawing to my attention if there are questions in the chat that I've missed, that sort of thing. Do feel free. We have some time together. I think people should feel free to raise their hands, their virtual hands, using, I believe you should have that as an option if they'd like to be unmuted and ask a question, or you can ask questions either using the webinar chat or the question and answer function. The meeting is being recorded, so we can share it with people who were not able to attend. So if you don't want your name read out, you might want to use the anonymous question and answer feature. But I'm hoping you will be willing to be unmuted and share questions or discuss issues directly. And there also will be time for questions and answers and discussion at the end of the presentation. The polling that we're talking about mostly today was conducted by Stratcom for West Coast Environmental Law from March 5th to 12th of this year. It had a sample size of 804, which is roughly equivalent to a margin of error of 3.5 percentage points, 19 times out of 20, for a poll that covers the province of British Columbia. We'll also be referring to some other recent polling data, primarily from Eco Analytics, which we came out after our polling data, but which is, we think, relevant. And I'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to that point in the presentation. So in 2022, West Coast Environmental Law launched the Sue Big Oil campaign along with other partner organizations and calling for local governments to uh, work together to bring a class action lawsuit against fossil fuel companies. At the time, we released what we called the Sue Big Oil messaging triangle. And we've updated that in light of the polling results that we've gotten, as well as our experience in using the tool. One of the things that's become clear to us is that this approach to messaging is not limited to those who are seeking to sue fossil fuel companies, but is in fact powerful. We think powerful messaging that more people in the climate movement should be using for a wide range of campaigns. And so the new version is called the climate costs messaging triangle, and you can use the first three pillars, the three main pillars of the messaging, without necessarily having a campaign that has anything to do with suing fossil fuel companies. Um, we do have a bonus pillar in the guide that we're sharing that provide some direction specifically about the idea of suing fossil fuel companies. But regardless of whether that's your campaign or not, we should all be drawing on the three main pillars. I should acknowledge that the messaging triangle is based to some degree on work done by Sightline Institute and other organizations in the US who published a slightly different version of the triangle some years ago. But we're going to use this structure um, to guide our conversations about the polling data as well. So let me read you an example of a climate costs narrative that's really grounded in this triangle. And I'd like you to think about how it's similar to and how it's different from the climate messages we often hear. The reality is that climate change, the heat trapping blanket of fossil fuel pollution around our planet, puts our communities at risk from storms, wildfires, and flooding, as well as degrading our roads, stormwater systems, and buildings. It's also driving up our food prices and insurance premiums. We know how to protect ourselves and our neighbors from the impacts of climate change, and this will also save money even in the relatively short term. Doing nothing puts human lives at risk and is the most costly option. Burning oil, gas, and coal is the primary cause of climate change, and fossil fuel companies from decades ago until now have worked against real climate solutions so that they can make massive profits. It's past time that they paid their fair share to keep our communities safe and our infrastructure working. At its core, the message can be summarized as climate change is threatening our community. We have the power to keep ourselves safe, and the companies that have profited most need to pay their share to allow us to do that. Real and local climate costs. Talking about the real and local climate costs is an antidote to this perception that climate change is a distant problem that we can solve later. We started our poll with a fairly standard question about the level of concern about climate change. And 69%, over two-thirds, said that they were concerned about climate change. And only less than one-third said that they were not concerned, either only a little concerned, or not too concerned, or not concerned at all. So on at one level, this actually looks really good. Over on the right, you can see some of the demographic breakdowns with those figures. But I think there's a temptation among climate groups to sort of look at this type of result and go, "Oh, great, climate change is still something Canadians or British Columbians are concerned about. That means that governments have political space to take action on climate change." Other polls actually have figures sometimes a little higher than 69%. But that's misleading because while it's absolutely true that people do remain concerned about climate change when asked, it's not a top of mind issue, and there are many other issues that people are more likely to vote on. At most, climate change at an abstract level could be a primary voting issue for the 28.9% of people who were very concerned. The question is, how do we talk about climate change in a way that will resonate and that conveys why it is an issue that the people need their governments to deal with? One of the first questions, the next question we asked in our poll was whether how concerned British Columbians were about a range of cost of living issues, things that sort of were more day to day, but were tied empirically to some degree or other to climate change. Note that as many people said that they were very concerned about food costs and cost of living, as said they were either very concerned or somewhat concerned about climate change. The level of very concerned was over twice what essentially twice what for those two costs what the very concerned was for climate change. Um, Concern for these issues, among these issues, not nearly as polarized as concern about climate change. Indeed, Conservative Party of BC voters were slightly more concerned about the cost of living, food, and taxes than the general public. We then asked the respondents whether they thought these different costs were caused by climate change. And as you'll see, 57% of British Columbians said that the food costs were either the climate change is the biggest cause or a major cause of increases in food costs. And significant percentages who saw links with water, with rebuilding after climate disasters, with increased home insurance, majorities for all of those um, categories. The polling suggest. Oh, I should also note that um, although there's some polarization about this perception of things being caused by climate change, it was less than you might think. Over one-third of those who said that they were not concerned about climate change, nonetheless, like 37%, nonetheless felt that it was the biggest or a major cause of the increases in food prices and home insurance. And those who were very concerned about an issue were the people who were most likely to see a connection to climate change, and therefore arguably most likely to be mobilized about addressing that connection. The polling suggests that any of these costs may be a good place to start in helping people link their experiences of costs in their day-to-day lives with the links to climate change, but especially these ones that are highlighted with especially food and food security, food and the costs of rebuilding after disasters. Water and home insurance may be more. Certain communities may see those connections more intensely. Interestingly enough, rural voters were more likely, or sorry, rural respondents rather, were more likely to see home insurance as being tied to climate change than urban respondents. And municipal costs, particularly in communities related to water in communities that are actually having to rebuild water systems, is a massive issue in a lot of parts of the province. This finding aligns somewhat with work done by Eco-Analytics that I mentioned earlier, who polled residents specifically in Metro Vancouver and the Capital and Regional District, so two urban centers. They were in the field March 20th to April 13th and canvassed the views of 1,064 people in Metro Vancouver and 452 in the CRD, so a somewhat smaller margin of error there. The polling asked a series of questions uh, that were aiming to identify different audience segments, and that's this list here on the right. Progressive activists make up 24% of the country, civic nationals make up 13%, etc. Some of you may be familiar with this terminology. The Eco-Analytics and Reclimate and others have talked about this as a sort of way of understanding different attitudes towards climate, energy, and environmental issues in Canada. I'm just flagging it because the slides we're going to look at from Eco-Analytics do talk about these groups a lot. I don't have the time to go through them in detail. I do want to emphasize that this isn't just a spectrum from progressive to conservative. It's more complicated than that. The top three groups are groups that are very concerned about climate change. Um, However, their sort of attitudes to social issues otherwise vary quite considerably. So we don't have time to go through it in detail, but I wanted to give some context as we look at the next slides. So Eco-Analytics asked whether it was better to talk about costs and climate preparedness in terms of climate change or in terms of preparing for extreme weather. Overall, they didn't actually make a huge difference. There was about a 1% higher support when climate change was discussed, but mentioning climate change drove up support among the audiences who were most likely to be concerned about climate change, specifically the progressive activists and the civic nationals, largely unchanged for the centrists, liberals, and a negative impact for the other two groups. They then asked whether they tried to test whether talking about building resilience, preparing for climate change, adapting to uh, climate change, which of these was most effective? And they found that adaptation, the language that we sort of often as sort of more academic climate activists or climate activists who are sort of following the international negotiations, we tend to talk about adaptation, that was the least effective uh, of the different frames. Otherwise, prepare was maybe slightly better, but similarities among climate engaged folks to prepare for both prepare and resilience. Now, as we saw, the polling data indicates that people are connecting increase in food prices and the like to climate change. And these are like many of these are costs that are already normalized. People have a sense that they are suffering those costs. You may not need sort of dollar values or really specific arguments or examples in order to bring people along, but some of us are very interested in sort of being able to point to dollar values and having some specifics around some of these costs that our communities are grappling with. So I just wanted to flag a few resources that are out there for the more people who might want to do a bit of a deep dive and talk, figure out some of the examples they can give. A climate reckoning was an examination of the economic cost to BC of the extreme weather in 2021, from the heat dome to the wildfires to the flooding. And it found that those events that year cost BC's economy between 10.6 and $17.1 billion, which is about 3 to 5% of the province's GDP. Prepare or Repair is a recent report by the Canadian Climate Institute that I really recommend very highly. They attempted to do actually something fairly narrow of calculating how much just relatively frequent new increases in heat and precipitation would cause in terms of increased maintenance costs of roads, storm drains, buildings, other public infrastructure. And they found that governments across Canada are currently paying an extra $8.8 billion a year due to these impacts from climate change. And they were not calculating, that doesn't include the sort of disasters where a huge storm wipes out a road or causes a landslide that blocks the highway or destroys a building. Those are purely the sort of chronic increases from just changes in the range of what precipitation and heat hit each of the regions in Canada. Interestingly, the figure is actually proportionally lower in BC. Have been trying to find out exactly why. Their estimate there is that it's about $580 million a year, but that's expected to rise to much more in line with BC's share of the infrastructure in the coming years. The one on the right is one that I wrote, where it's an example of just trying to scour the internet and available resources from municipalities to come up with what we can say about the cost of a particular community. And so, if people are interested in trying to do that at a community level, it may be a resource that you'd like to take a look at. And I think. Yeah, Ben's put links to these in the chat, as well as some blog posts where we attempt to talk about some of the cost of food, home insurance, and impacts on infrastructure. Okay. So in talking about real local climate costs, I think the important thing is to emphasize that climate change does put essential infrastructure and ourselves and our neighbors at risk, and it increases the cost of food, home insurance, and water systems. There's a tendency, and I think more message testing needs to be done about this, but there's a tendency to sort of point to the really major disaster scenarios. The Lytton's being burnt down, the flooding in Abbotsford as being evidence of climate costs, while ignoring the much more day-to-day impacts that climate change has on our cost of food, on home insurance, because home insurance is how we deal with risk, of course. So, the fact that there's a risk of those catastrophic events that has increased affects our home insurance on a day-to-day basis, and figuring out ways to help people make the link with those more daily costs is important. We'll talk about this more in the next section, but the purpose of climate action is to keep residents safe. Um, it can be helpful to identify tangible examples of climate impacts that are occurring in a particular community and talk about those. And some communities have done a good job of identifying at least some of the costs that they are incurring or which they expect to incur due to climate change. There's a number of municipalities in BC are currently experimenting with a methodology called the Cost of Doing Nothing toolkit from an organization called ICLEI. And you know, there's going to be more of that. I think we need to encourage and support governments to answer questions about how much climate change is actually costing locally. So the next pillar in our messaging triangle is protect our communities. It's an antidote to the message that climate change is too big and scary to do anything about, this massive global problem. We asked respondents whether they would like to have their local governments, they would rather have their local governments, on the one hand, spend what it takes to keep their communities safe from climate impacts, even if that meant raising taxes, versus keeping tax increases to a minimum, even if that means not addressing the threat of climate change, not taking preventative measures to address extreme weather, future disasters, and other climate impacts. And although we would have preferred to have, a sizable majority saying let's spend what it takes, we had a large plurality. We had almost a majority, 49%, and significantly less who said no, keep taxes to uh, a minimum. You'll see the breakdown on some of the breakdown of that on the right. We're going to come back to finances in a bit in the third section, but as we'll see, British Columbians actually do not like tax increases. This is like their least preferred option to actually pay for these types of measures. And yet, when push comes to shove, 49% said, well, if that's the way to keep our community safe, we'll grin and bear it, sort of thing. So I think that's significant. Similarly, Eco-Analytics asked people to imagine that their municipality was preparing a plan to invest in measures to protect residents. And they were testing whether protect residents from flooding, extreme heat, smoke, wildfire smoke, and water shortages, or measures to protect them to reduce future emergency response costs. Protection did significantly better, 7% overall, and better in all of the different segments that they were looking at. And you'll note really the largest increase in civic nationals and in the disengaged middle. So that's significant. Uh, they I'm sorry, I'm not sure I completed the question. They asked them to say whether they should move ahead with those investments now. And yeah, I mean, like significant majorities said, 55% said yes, they should move ahead with those majorities now. Wasn't expressly compared to sort of the tax implications like our question did, but it's a very consistent result. And protection came up again and again. Now, they were focused on climate adaptation in these questions. They also asked what the benefits of taking that type of plan, investing in that type of plan was. And the top four measures are the benefits that people identified, excuse me, are all sort of very directly protection focused. This is their slide, not mine. I didn't put the protection in. That's their framing. So, in summary, when we talk in the second pillar about protecting our communities, we need to characterize climate action as aimed at protecting residents from climate impacts and keeping municipal infrastructure functioning when there are disasters. If you have that tangible example we spoke about, the next thing, we can illustrate how the plan, how the options we're looking at will help people keep safe from that particular threat. Um, it's important where possible. Obviously, it's depending on the campaign you're running or the work you're doing, this may not fit. But if you are able to talk about actions that involve, again, we should be avoiding the word adaptation, but preparation, protection, measures that focus on local safety, I think that it makes sense to lead with that. But at the same time, we believe, and I will acknowledge here that we don't have adequate message testing to say this with confidence. We believe that the public doesn't make the same differentiation that sort of climate activists or climate policy geeks do between adaptation and reduction. We believe that the public understands that reducing pollution is also about protecting our community and communities around the world, doing our part to reduce risks here and elsewhere. More message testing is required to do that, but characterizing measures that um, uh, reduce emissions as being part of a suite of tools to protect our communities, we think is important. Certainly, the thing to emphasize here is that failing to protect us from climate change puts us all at risk and will cost us more in the near future. This is not a distant problem. The it's perhaps worth mentioning here another report by the Canadian Climate Institute that found that, and I'll have to get the name if anyone wants it. I'm drawing a blank on it at the moment, but which found that Climate adaptation by itself can reduce harm to communities by about 50%, and climate mitigation, the reduction of greenhouse gases globally, can reduce harm to communities by about 50%. Together, they can reduce the harm to our communities by about 75%. So, there is a basis for making that connection. Polluters must pay. This is an antidote to the message that we're all responsible for climate change, and so we can't hold anyone responsible. It's also an antidote to the idea that there's no money available to allow us um, to take the type of action required. I'm sorry, I've lost my place here. So we asked British Columbians how they wanted their local governments. The focus of our poll was on local governments to address increased costs from climate change, and they were clear that they did not want new taxes. I mentioned this earlier. This was the least popular option. Just 23% supported increasing taxes. Only 4.1% of that was strongly. Well, 66% opposed it. But and so when we come back to that question earlier, where people were willing to raise taxes if it was necessary to protect their community, we have to balance that and have a bit of nuance as we struggle as we talk about the relationship between that answer and this answer. Clearly, campaigns should not just assume raising taxes, but should be looking to other ways to raise those funds, with taxes being part of a broader conversation. But interestingly, cutting other services and also delaying action on making our communities safer, on climate resilience, were also not options that the public was particularly keen on. What they are interested in and looking for are for governments the senior levels of government to pay for the costs of keeping our communities safe. Um, and that makes some sense given that these are governments that do receive significantly more, for the most part, benefit from the fossil fuel industry, who have a wide range of tools at their disposal um, to um, to raise funds from other sources. Although ultimately, of course, they are another level that's being paid for by taxes. I think it's interesting here in BC. The BC government's quietly dropped its funding for the local government climate action plan, which is one of the major sources of funding to local governments for climate action, and is rolling back its funding for BC Fire Smart. So I think there are legitimate questions about the sort of commitment from senior levels of government to actually keep communities safe from climate change, and that the environmental movement could do more in challenging them on those types of cuts that put our communities at risk. But secondly, respondents want their local governments to work with other local governments and with others to seek compensation from major polluters, such as the fossil fuel industry. 71% overall supported that, but notice that the strong support for seeking compensation from major polluters is actually higher than strong support from seeking funding from other governments. Uh, 35% basically strong support for that action. And, as I said, 71%. There was support across the political spectrum with every party, from the BC Conservative Party to the NDP and Green voters and undecideds. There was over 50% support for seeking compensation for major polluters, as well as for funding from other levels of government. We can see also in eco-analytics that there is this concern over how are we going to pay for the cost of keeping our communities safe, of dealing with climate change. They asked what information people would most want to know um, about implementing a plan to protect their residents from the impacts of climate change, and how the city would pay was the number one concern identified, but also how much the plan would cost was the third. So, very significant costs, as well as wanting to know how much risks would be reduced. So, once we're talking about climate change, like climate costs, once people understand that there are these climate costs, both the costs of climate change itself and the costs of keeping our communities safe, the question of who should pay and how we're going to pay for this is natural. Um, And in fact, ignoring that becomes a fiscally irresponsible and indefensible choice. We know that fossil fuels are the largest source of greenhouse gases, although Keep in mind that less than 50%, according to some polls, of Canadians know that. Talking about the responsibility of the industry in both providing the products that give rise to climate change, but also their role in misinformation campaigns and lobbying against climate action, so that they could make massive profits, and continuing to do that so they can make massive profits, is a in this context is not just sort of let's vilify the industry or regulate an industry where it's in an abstract way. It's about a conversation about how to save costs for ordinary people, money for ordinary people, and getting the resources we need to keep our communities safe. And in the context of that discussion, we have a great opportunity to educate them on the actual causes of climate change and the role of the fossil fuel industry in creating that harm. The reality is, if the polluters aren't paying them, the ordinary people are, ordinary taxpayers are, or we all are in terms of the harm that we end up paying or the additional costs we end up paying for directly or in paying to avoid them. And failing, if the companies do not have to pay, they have an incentive to continue to put short-term profits ahead of our community's safety and continue to working to keep us hooked on their products and uh, calling for false solutions. Oh, I've gone past again. So our bonus pillar, and the one that obviously is tied to the Sue Big Oil campaign, is we need a climate costs recovery class action lawsuit. This is an antidote to fossil fuel companies are too big to take on, as well as, again, there's not enough money to fight climate change. In many ways, this is sort of a part two, the polluters must pay. There are other ways to make polluters pay, but this is an option that we can do under existing laws, and sort of right now without the help of senior levels of government. So the messaging triangle talks about this. Now, the idea of a climate cost recovery class action has been championed by the Sue Big Oil campaign. I mentioned that campaign earlier in the presentation. I've given a whole bunch of presentations about that. I'm happy to discuss it more in questions. It's not primarily a communications, there's a bunch of questions that are sort of more legal than communications focused. So I'm not going to go through this in detail right now. I'll just say we have 11 municipalities that have pledged to work towards a class action lawsuit, including pledging some money towards that. The uh, they collectively represent about 500,000 people, and we need them to figure out which of the local governments is actually going to file the class action, file the case, because that municipality will be stepping into a more important role supported by the other local governments. There are over 70 local and state governments bringing similar cases in the US and around the world. And there are legal experts, including ourselves here in Canada, who believe that this absolutely can be done here as well. Um, so we asked in our poll whether people supported the idea of their local governments working together to bring a class action lawsuit rather than passing increased costs on to taxpayers. And over two-thirds of British Columbians supported the idea, 67.4%. So basically, and 33% of that was strong support. Again, some of the breakdown is on the right. There was actually relatively low opposition to this. We asked a version of this question, essentially the same question in 2022 when we launched the Civic Oil campaign, and support has dropped slightly by about 1.5% since 2022. But we're very happy with, there still being over two-thirds support and a low level opposition. Interestingly, 46% of people who said that they were not concerned, or concerned only a little, or not concerned at all about climate change, nonetheless supported this legal action. And there was also majority support across all political parties. So, from a communications point of view, I want to emphasize you don't need to be a legal expert to agree that fossil fuel companies should be sued. This is a moral issue. Right now, our communities are paying these costs. Our local governments have an option that actually, because of the way class action law works, is relatively low risk to work together and attempt to get some of that money back. so that we can have the resources to keep our communities safe from climate change. Unlike other approaches to polluter pays, such as windfall taxes or from well cleanup, climate superfund laws, a lawsuit exists. This type of lawsuit would use existing legal tools, so it doesn't require senior levels of government that are arguably captured by industry to act, and it can target global fossil fuel companies for the harm that they've caused in Canada, and not just their current emissions, but their historic emissions, the emissions that they've caused up till now. Our goal here is to ensure that local governments know that we expect them to bring this type of case, and that we'll support them when they do so. So, if you're interested in the Subig Oil campaign, and interested in getting involved in the Subig Oil campaign, there's a few things that you could do right now, or when you have a moment. You can sign the Climate Costs Recovery Declaration, which calls on local governments to participate in this initiative. We have a Discord channel for activists who are interested in exploring their involvement in this and getting becoming volunteers. And we also have a form that you can sign up on to indicate your interest in volunteering. The campaign is focused on British Columbia. We're happy to talk to people from beyond the borders of the province about what could be done in your own jurisdictions, or whether there are other groups out there that you could be talking to. But just be aware that the focus of the campaign is on BC. Ben will put in links to, or if he hasn't already done so, to those three types of action in the chat. You can also use those QR codes, especially if this is, you're watching a recording after the fact and want to take any of those actions. Use the QR codes to sign up. The climate costs messaging triangle document ends with a discussion of some of the types of attacks that we often hear about climate action, and how a response that takes place within the climate costs framework might respond to those. The attempt here, these are just two examples of them. There's a few more in the brief. But what we're trying to illustrate here is the ways that you can rotate between the different pillars to respond to people based on where they are, where they're coming from, and to bring them around to. And they're not going to convince everybody, obviously, but based on the polling, this type of messaging appeals to a significant percentage of Canadians and British Columbia, or certainly British Columbians, and we believe Canadians as well. So, you've been listening to me for about 35 minutes or so, and I'd like to open it up. We have a lot of people on the call, or who are have background in climate communications, who will have a lot of their own knowledge and experience. So I'm certainly happy to take questions about what I've said, about the lessons we take from the polling, about the Subig Oil campaign. But I'd also invite folks, if they want to share anything about what might resonate from this messaging approach in your work, whether you have made efforts to incorporate cost of living conversations into your climate work. Do you talk about climate action as protection and how that might have worked? Or do you think that climate costs is a good way to talk about the responsibility of the fossil fuel industry and the polluter pays principle? Um, Feel free to put up your hands. I see we have a few questions in the Q&A. Um, so I'll just go there. But yeah, put any questions in the chat, or raise your hands. I'm assuming I think you should have a raise hand function. But if you'd like to comment on any of that. If you don't have a raise hand function, let me know in the chat so I don't keep bugging people to raise their hands. All right. So I see from Connie, will you comment on BC law regarding who pays court costs in class action cases? So this is a technical point. It's one of the reasons that in BC, the costs of a class action are fairly manageable. And that's because usually when you bring a court case, there's a risk that the other side, if the other side wins, that you will have to pay a portion, and potentially a significant portion, of their legal fees. Um, Under class action legislation in BC, that's not the case. And British Columbians, the BC class action legislation says basically unless someone is acting inappropriately and abusing the court process, that each party will bear their own costs. So that's helpful. I should say there are some other provinces that also that don't. There are no other provinces that have that, but there are other provinces that do have relatively low adverse costs rules and some and or some potential funding to cover those costs. So BC is not totally unique, but it's one of the more favorable jurisdictions. I see that there is a comment from Missa or Misa. Um, just expressing hope that that people may have had trouble because of the sunny weather making it, and that hopefully people will have a chance to watch the video in the future and to use the weather patterns to upgrade to highlight the um, the impacts of climate change, the cost of climate change. All right, I'm not seeing. Have I missed a question? No. Okay. Not seeing hands. If anyone, I would welcome questions either in the chat or raise your hand if you're interested in unmuting. Not able to copy and paste from the chat. Will you email the resources and declaration links to the attendees? Yes, we can do that. I'll be frank, I was expecting more. Oh, thank you, Tom. I was just going to say I was expecting a few more questions. So I encourage people to jump in. Otherwise, I mean, I'm sure everyone wants to get back out on this lovely evening, but it's an opportunity to connect with one another. Hi, Tom.
Hi, Andrew. Thanks for this. This is just to ask, has the city of Victoria jumped in on this one? Or are they still sitting on the fence?
I would say they're still sitting on the fence. Uh, they did pass a motion asking the Union of BC municipalities uh, to consider a resolution calling on the province to take the lead in a class action lawsuit on behalf of local governments. Some of the councillors were clear that they don't expect the province to do that, but saw value in the province being asked to, and certainly raising the profile of the issues. Others, I think, may have seen it more of a way of saying that they were taking action without necessarily the city signing on itself. So absolutely, we're still looking for the city of Victoria to join. There's a complete list of the municipalities that have joined on the About Us page of subigoil.ca.
Is there a local group in Victoria?
Yes, there are volunteers who meet monthly in Victoria. There are a couple of them are planning to be at the Moss Street Market with a table this Saturday. So if you're in Victoria and happen to be going to the Moss Street Market, come drop by and say hi. Yeah, but yes, absolutely. And you can either uh, email me or sign up to the Discord and or the volunteer list, and we can put you in touch with them.
Okay, yeah. Thanks, Andrew. I'll do that.
Thanks, Tom. Okay, I see we have a couple more written questions. Karen asks, do you think people will want specific example of foods that have increased in price due to climate change? If so, what are the best examples? I think it's probably important to emphasize that there are the impacts of climate change can sort of affect food prices in a range of ways and somewhat unpredictably. But the sort of classic examples would be chocolate, which is always a popular choice, and cocoa. Sorry, coffee rather. Both of which are very heat vulnerable crops. Bananas have often fluctuated in price due to climate change. And but I think the thing to emphasize is that farmers require relatively stable conditions to grow crops. And while there may, be another farmer who's not in a drought or flood prone, the area that isn't subject to a drought or a flood this year, we live in a global market, and significant increases in the frequency of any of these things is going to cause periodic shortages and uncertainty in the food markets. And from Alex and Sabina. Hi, Andrew. Could you speak to the timeliness of such a class action suit, please? Also, is there a federal component that can be explored? Great questions. Thank you for these questions. The in terms of the timeline, the there is no doubt that litigation takes time. What we always emphasize here is that the first step in a class action lawsuit is to have the class action certified. This is a stage where the judge says, yes, it is appropriate for this case to be heard as a class action. And as part of that, the judge has to make a ruling that the case has legal merit. That means right at the very beginning of the process, you get a judge looking at what types of issues the plaintiffs, the local governments will have to prove to bring a case, and whether there are any sort of defenses that the fossil fuel industry defendants will be able to assert that prevent them from that could prevent the case from proceeding under any circumstances, and define really how Canadian law applies to this type of litigation. And that'll be the first time that's happened. So that's a hugely important step. And should, as we expect, the judge say, yes, this case could be won, local governments could be successful, the fossil fuel companies will have to disclose to their shareholders and investors that that ruling has been made and that there's a risk that they could lose this type of case. So it's uh, right at the beginning, we get some immediate impacts on the sort of perceived profitability of the industry and a profile of the case. The actual timeline to recover costs is longer. It certainly, it took. I don't think that it needs to take as long as the tobacco litigation that the province launched took, but that took like 30 years. The province launched a case against the opioid manufacturers and managed to get a settlement within a couple of years from one of the manufacturers. So that's also seems unlikely that there would be a settlement in this type of case, but there's a lot of unknowns about how quickly this would proceed. We're likely talking about a decade. But keep in mind that local governments borrow money to make investment decisions or to make infrastructure investments on that type of time frame all the time. So this isn't unusual. In terms of a federal component that can be explored, um, the federal government has a lot of climate costs too. Not as much as local governments or the provincial government. Local governments have about they own 60% of public infrastructure. They've, at least in terms of some of the costs, it's been estimated that they pay about 72% of the climate costs. Um, the federal government, by contrast, has much smaller areas that are affected by that they sort of manage directly, and so they don't have as high a climate costs, but they are funding a lot of things that are affected by climate change, and including climate adaptation. And so they could bring this type of action themselves. And I think certainly any conversation about costs can actually, can equally be directed at the federal government and asking them, why are you supporting, uh, these industries that are increasing our costs, and why are you not recovering some of those costs so that we can pay for them if you're going to allow them to proceed? So thanks for that question. Mary asks, what are your thoughts on how municipal election candidates might frame some talking points on climate action based on the study? So we actually delivered a workshop, a similar presentation specifically for candidates in the municipal elections that was about this polling data and what we thought were the takeaways. And there is a candidates brief on the Subig Oil website, and I believe the West Coast Environmental Law website. Ben, could you maybe see if you can find that and throw it into the chat?
Sure.
The candidates brief is a good start to answering the question. It's very similar to this, except it's more focused on what they can do as opposed to sort of the communications to the public. So it's like, we have these costs as a community, opponents that aren't recognizing that are they're sort of in denial. I have a plan that will help us protect our community, and I have a plan recover some of the to make sure that these costs are not borne solely by taxpayers. Um, it's you can see how that tracks the three pillars. If they want to also talk about the possibility of suing, I think depending on the community, they may want to just say we're going to look at all legal options, including the idea of a lawsuit. In other communities, it may be quite fine to say if we don't recover these costs from the industry, we're going to end up paying more. So we're going to be joining this effort to bring a class action lawsuit. There is actually a recording of that, but we're sort of primarily making it available to people who are running. So uh, Ben, I don't know if that's something you can find quickly and throw in the chat. I would ask you not to just share it willy-nilly, but if you wanted to share the link to that, they have to indicate where they are running and what position they're running for in order to view the video. But sorry, Ben, I should have looked for that before it didn't occur to me that we'd be sharing that. But absolutely, if someone's running, it'd be great for them to be able to take a look at it. Okay. So again, I think we're out of questions and we're a few minutes before the hour. So we maybe people can I'm happy to take more questions, but if people are not feeling like asking anymore, then I would very much appreciate the time you've given us. Um, and video for folks are running in the municipal election. Oh, so Ben will make a note and email. Brian, the link is above, but we can try and pass that on to you as well. And I've heard from a few people running in Souk, so good luck to all of you. Okay, last call for questions. All right. Well, thank you very much for letting us take some of your time on a sunny evening. We appreciate, I know that there are people here who do a ton of work, and I'm sure you all do, and we really appreciate the work you do and that you've um, and I hope that you found something useful in what we were sharing. Release you back into the world.